Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's presentation, Anti-Racism and Anti-Semitism, True Justice and Uncomfortable Truths. My name is Dexter Van Zyl, and I'm your host for this afternoon. Our speaker today is Reverend Dumasani Washington. Pastor Washington is founder and CEO of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. Prior to his work at IBSI, Reverend Dumasani worked as outreach coordinator for the Christians United for Israel. Pastor Washington is a professional musician and author of Zionism and the Black Church. Why Standing with Israel will be a defining issue for Christians of color in the 21st century. Pastor Dumasani will speak for 25 to 30 minutes or so, and we will then continue with a Q&A session with written questions. We really want to hear from you. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon for Q&A. Please submit questions during the talk. But before we get into the presentation, I would like to offer a personal note of gratitude for the expressions of support, financial and otherwise, that have come our way in the aftermath of the confrontation that took place in June at a rally organized by the UMass Boston chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. We want to thank our generous donors who make programs like this possible. So let's begin. Good afternoon, Reverend.
Good afternoon, Dexter, and thank you everyone at camera for hosting me on today. It's great to be with you and great to have this type of topic here, though it'll be somewhat controversial. Hopefully we can get to some clear understandings, have some great conversations as well. I also want to say in this time of so many virtual meetings, I am in my office. I do have grandkids, and we even have people that are visiting, so you shouldn't hear any noise, but if you do, just know that the Washington House is kind of a Grand Central Station right around now. So let's begin. The title that we've chosen for the discussion, obviously it's kind of self-explanatory. Hopefully, however, in this discussion, which is so needed now, we can again have a very good and productive discussion. As Dexter was saying, I am the CEO of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. I will refer to the organization to somewhat because much of what we'll discuss here, our organization covers, and also in the book that I wrote, Zionism and the Black Church. So you can go to the website there if you want more information. So let's begin. We're going to kind of unpack two main points of focus on this conversation, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to have, in order to do that, we're going to have to kind of give a little bit of a retrospective to where we are. And when I talk about two main things, we're talking about two ideological approaches that kind of converge: critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, both of which could take hours to discuss because of the different iterations, how they've evolved, but particularly Black Lives Matter as an organization, which actually started in 2013, how it is connected to some other movements, whether they be civil rights or whether they be anti-Zionist, because we're going to, again, we'll unpack those together, and how that kind of converges even on critical race theory, certain parts of it. So what I want to do for the first part of this is just give some quotes for context. So what I'm going to do is click on one more thing here. There's one thing about whenever we do these screen share things, stuff happens kind of weird on the screen, so I have to move that. Apologize for that strange here. I want to start here by looking a little bit at the history of critical race theory, what it actually is, beyond the headlines, right? But let's actually start with what the actual gist of it is. And this is an article by Aaron Sibarium, 1976, and I'm quoting the article, 2 decades after Brown versus Board, the landmark education decision in terms of separate but equal in the United States, outlawed segregated schools. The critical race theorist Derek Bell published an influential critique of the decision. Bell, a former civil rights attorney, did not object to the ruling in principle, but rather to how courts were construing it. In the name of equal opportunity, schools had been ordered to achieve a racial balance that reflected the demographics of their surrounding district, even when doing so hurt Black students. I want to emphasize this again. This is where this actually begins as an attorney, in this discussion that Derek Bell actually publishes becomes something that's discussed within a legal framework. And again, his critique wasn't about Brown versus Board of Education, that decision, but it was about how it was implemented. I can tell you that even as a theory that we're addressing, I can tell you as a person who was born in the late 60s, born in the segregated South, but raised in California, my family, as many of the others, experienced what this actually talked about. This had everything to do with quotas. It has everything to do with busing, which we can't unpack all of those things in our time here, but this is what Derek Bell was addressing, how the actual decision was being implemented. I continue. He quotes, low academic performance and large numbers of disciplinary and expulsion cases are only two of the predictable outcomes in integrated schools. Again, I have to say, and excuse me for that, he is not and was not attacking the integration of schools, but how it was done. Ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that this has been an ongoing debate within the Black community since the 1960s. This has been an ongoing debate, not even so much whether or not schools should have been integrated or should be integrated, but how it actually happened. And you may be thinking, oh, that was 40, 50, 60 years ago. No, right now, today, which is why this debate is so critical even right now, right? Continuing on in this article, Bell's articles helped jumpstart the legal movement now called critical race theory, which has become the latest battleground in America's culture war. Among conservatives, the term now functions as a synonym for pop, quote, anti-racism and the diversity gurus associated with it, particularly Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. Now, again, this is a broader discussion about the history of how critical race theory, what it began as, and what it has evolved to, particularly as it is associated with the term and the concept of anti-racism, which we'll touch on as well. I'll say this last thing. I'll share a little bit of an anecdote here. I'm just gonna drink a little bit of water, sorry. When I was a young boy, my mother explained to me these types of things, without these terms, she explained to me the impact of integration, what happened during the time of segregation. Again, they're from North Little Rock, Arkansas. During the time of segregation, some of you who know your American history, you know that Central High School in North Little Rock was actually among the first to be desegregated during this time of that portion of the civil rights movement, which the point of it was to destroy the Jim Crow system, which had relegated almost subhuman status to Black people throughout the segregated South. And one of the things she discussed with me when I was a very little boy was the debate within the Black community about this very thing, how schools were made fair and equal access to them. And part of the dividing line, ladies and gentlemen, had to do with portions of the Black community wanting integration, wanting to go to school with white students, and another portion who did not want integration, but wanted the tax dollars more equitably distributed, because that would often be how the racist practice of schools would actually happen. Although tax dollars were being paid, they were often, the lion's share would go to the white schools, and then the rest would go to Black schools, which are more poorly funded. That became some of the debate, and it kind of funneled into integration. So we remember having those discussions back then. And this is an article by Thomas Sowell, the economist, from years ago, but I want to give you a little bit more of a prism here, right? For a period of 85 years, Thomas Sowell says, Dunbar High School was an academically elite all-Black public high school in Washington, D.C. As far back as 1899, Dunbar students came in first in citywide tests given in both Black and white schools. Over the 85-year span, most of Dunbar's graduates went on to college, and even though most Americans, white or Black, did not, he continues, most Dunbar graduates could afford only to attend the low-cost local colleges, either federally supported Howard University or tuition-free minors Teachers College. However, those Dunbar graduates who attended Harvard, Amherst, Oberlin, and other prestigious institutions, usually on scholarship, ran up an impressive record of academic honors. For example, it is known that Amherst admitted 34 Dunbar graduates between 1892 and 1954. Again, ladies and gentlemen, long before the civil rights movement began in the late 1800s. Of these, 74% were graduated, and more than 1/4 of these graduates were Phi Beta Kappas. What is the connection to what Thomas Sowell is saying and what Derek Bell is actually saying? Is that this was the concept. or the pushback, particularly from the Black community. When you artificially made something quote unquote more diverse, right? In other words, if you just simply brought in different people of different colors or different ethnicities, and you weren't placing them academically in terms of the rigor which they were prepared, you weren't necessarily going to get something that was a favorable outcome. This entirely Black school with this very high academic achievement was a part of a system within Washington, D.C. And when laws were changed in terms of schools, children being able to, because children could go to Dunbar High School from different areas from all around, but when they made it so that the school had to reflect a certain amount of students from a certain area, if you will, then they were no longer as a school able to choose students that were a best fit for the school. This debate goes back to W.B. Du Bois, who had the concept of the talented tenth, being able to take those young people. He was the forerunner of the gifted and talented classes before they even existed. And it wasn't, people got upset with him, but it wasn't an elitist thing. It was if these young people are more apt in these certain areas, they should receive this type of training to better prepare them. And it's not a one size fits all. It continues to be a controversial topic even today. Ibrahim Kendi, one of the main anti-racist thinkers, if you will, on today, this is someone asked him recently to define racism, and he defined it as such. Racism is this is a literal quote, racism is a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, without any sarcasm, simply say that those of us who, if you've had to study on any level in terms of college and critical thinking, when you define a word by using the word, that means that you probably don't know what the word means, or you're being purposely obtuse. In other words, if I define chair by telling you a chair is a chair that you sit in and you're comfortable, that means I probably can't define it. So if I define racism as racist policies, right, without really explaining to you what racist means, that becomes a kind of circular logic, right? And this is part of the debate that's happening now, because what critical race theory was, as we saw with Derek Bell, actually criticizing and the implementation of something that was supposed to be good. In other words, the dismantling of a racist school district, a racist school system, and how that dismantling, how that is actually applied, has now, unfortunately, in pop culture, become things like defining racism by racism. Okay, this is part of the debate that's actually raging now, right? Article by Christopher Rufo, still on critical race theory. In contrast to equality, equity as defined and promoted by critical race theorists, now he's talking about this modern iteration, is little more than reformulated Marxism, and we'll touch on that as well. I guarantee you. In the name of equity, UCLA law professor and critical race theorist Cheryl Harris has proposed suspending private property rights, seizing land and wealth, and redistributing them along racial lines. Okay, this is what it has devolved into. Continuing in the article, critical race guru Ibram X. Kendi, who directs the Center of Anti-Racist Research at Boston University, has proposed the creation of a federal Department of Anti-Racism. This department would be independent of, for example, or unaccountable to the elected branches of government, and would have the power to nullify, veto, or abolish any law at any level of government and curtail the speech of political leaders and others who are deemed insufficiently, quote, anti-racist. Remember, this is the same man who could not define racism. So the problem is that if I cannot define racism sufficiently, I cannot define anti-racist cause. I'm not saying that the racism cannot be defined, right? The discrimination of someone based on their skin color, ethnic background, or origin, that type of, we can have all kinds of definitions that are applicable that don't use the word racist, right? But here, if I'm not able to define racist without using the word racist, and now I'm plunging into anti-racism, part of the danger, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are now discussing things in very broad terms, things that are very, very crucial, but we have to be very, very clear about what it is that we're discussing. another article by Pamela Paresky. And this connects now to what we'll touch about in a minute, the critical ethnic studies. The subtlety is that instead of targeting Jews directly, now in this article, she's talking about how it devolves into attacking Jews. Please look at this. The target of critical social justice is whiteness. Remember, once I can't really define the issues of discrimination or racism, or if I refuse to do it in very definite terms, right, in clear speech, right, if I begin to speak in whole broad descriptions, whether of ethnic groups or of even a theory, if you will, if I'm just going to not really tease it out and have a real discussion, but just speak in generalities, the danger becomes this. In 2018, when Hasidic Jews were victims of a wave of violent attacks, a precursor to another cluster of bloody attacks to come a year later, Mark Winston Griffith, the executive director of the Black Movement Center in Crown Heights, told the Forward that some Black Americans see Judaism, quote, as a form of almost hyper-whiteness. I'm sure we'll get into our discussion portion. Some of you may have heard the term white passing. Back in the day in the Black community, that was called, we would just say it a different way, passing for white, a Black person who was so mixed in terms of their ethnic background between Black and white, European and African, that they could quote unquote pass. This is some of the terms that we're hearing now, not just hyper-whiteness, but white passing. And it's oftentimes connected or directed at the Jewish community. Once I now begin to vilify or even describe, and particularly in less than flattering terms in the context of race, an entire group of people, like quote unquote white, right? Quote unquote European, when I begin to ascribe to them values or begin to describe who are Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, I'm into a dangerous area here, because I am now almost as a herd mentality. I am now saying this group of people is this group of people, this. This is what often devolves into a certain amount of anti-Jewish thinking. And I'll say it this way, I always often say this to students. Whenever there becomes this whole discussion about these groups of people are this, these groups of people are evil, these group of people are quote unquote racist, I can guarantee history has proven to us that at some point, every group will, or each group will begin to agree, or it'll become a situation where the Jewish people, because anti-Semitism, the oldest hatred in humanity, that will often become a vacuum that gets directed towards the Jewish people. I'll tell you what I mean by this. Let's finish this one article. Race is the locus of power in the critical justice worldview, which holds that the dominant group, white people, here we go, will, when it serves their interests, conditionally invite minority groups into whiteness. When people such as light-skinned Jews gain benefits of whiteness by dropping ethnic markers of difference, as California's ethnic studies model curriculum teaches, those people gain conditional whiteness. We've been hearing these terms quite a bit over the last several years. Let me say this to you about the ethnic studies model curriculum. I live now in North Carolina. I lived almost all of my life in California, and the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel was and continues to be a part of the fight that has been challenging both the anti-Semitism and even the anti-Black racism that is inherent in the ethnic studies model curriculum. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, there were several of the versions of this curriculum that literally encourage young people to boycott Israel, to organize protests against Israel. It actually also demeans civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers. They called them docile, weak. Why? Because they were trying to work within the system to uncover and break a broken system, right? They were trying to work within the system of government. They were protesting, where they were actually the apex of the civil rights movement was the landmark decisions of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill, right? The critical ethnic studies model, unfortunately, even attacks those people are not being radical enough. These are the types of things that often don't make the headlines, but Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel very much involved in that fight. And how do we connect this to some of that's going on now? In her own words, co-founder Patrice Cullors of Black Lives Matter.
He was concerned, or is concerned, that that there's a lack of perhaps ideological direction in Black Lives Matter that would allow it to fizzle out, and as he said, in comparison to Occupy Wall Street. As you are advancing your own organization, as you all are headed to Cleveland to participate in this Black Lives Movement conference, how do you respond to that particular critique? Again, a loving critique from an elder of the struggle that some others share, that I've even shared as well, to be frank, as a concern about, in part because of the co-optation and the appropriation, that a more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on ideological theories. What she means by that is critical theory, okay? Critical theory, which is part of a Marxist ideology, which is explaining to you, among other things, ascribes certain values to certain people depending on their demographic, right? Not based on who they are, but they're either the color of their skin or how much money they have. Ladies and gentlemen, history has proven to us that is always dangerous. And in that identity politics game, the people who will be attacked the most will be the Jewish people, right? It'll become a left side of the aisle, right side of the aisle. At some point, the people will begin to, who subscribe to this mentality, will begin to believe that it's the Jews who are doing X, Y, and Z. And this is why it becomes very dangerous. It becomes, not that we don't need to have a conversation. No, we can't just in whole cloth say, okay, here's what critical race theory is in a nutshell, let's just go ahead and discard it. No, we need to unpack it, but we do need to be honest about it when we're unpacking it. So for example, after the death of George Floyd, these are the types of propaganda pictures, if you will, memes that came out from Black Lives Matter. An Israeli soldier on the neck of a Palestinian person and the white cop Derek Chauvin on the neck of George Floyd. This is disgusting. This is not true, right? But this is the type of rhetoric that begins to gain traction when you begin to demonize people either based on their skin color or based on stuff like your lack of understanding of the Middle East conflict, right? This was, and my son Joshua Washington, who's executive director, wrote several articles about this. They're on Times of Israel. You can also get them on our Substack as well. That link will be on the IPSI website as well. And we talked about why this is so dangerous, but this actually has a history. Let's keep going.
We realized, oh, we need to take our solidarity a step further. We need to be more public. And so one of the first delegations that went to Palestine was led by the Dream Defenders. It was folks from Ferguson, folks from Black Lives Matter, folks from Dream Defenders, and we went on a solidarity trip.
We come to a land that has been stolen by greed and destroyed by hate. We come here and we learn laws that have been co-signed and inked but written in the blood of the innocent. From Ferguson to Palestine, the struggle for freedom continues.
Even more reason why we should be showing up. And took several other delegations into Palestine after that. And I think in some ways have been laying the foundation for the more public-facing solidarity. I think that's been incredibly powerful for our movement.
What in the world does improving the quality of Black lives have to do with demonizing Israel? Again, this has a long history.
Actions, always. The other thing I'll say is Palestine is our generation South Africa. And if we don't step up boldly and courageously to end the imperialist project that's called Israel, we're doomed.
This has been going on not just since George Floyd, this has been going on since shortly after Black Lives Matter was founded. Why? It has a mentality of a Marxist approach, a let's ascribe value and worth. Again, the founder, one of the founders tells you we are trained Marxists and we are very well versed in ideological theory.
Israel, we know you murder children too. Israel, we know you murder children too.
One of the ways you obfuscate something, ladies and gentlemen, is you have two parallel narratives running at the same time. You say this movement is about Black lives. This is about Black people being either murdered or harmed by racist white police officers or criminal justice system. And what you also have is a parallel movement that says, and we blame Israel and the Jews. If you can keep those narratives moving, have one in the forefront and one in the background, you can create enough confusion that people begin to fight about what's actually happening, which is part of the point. When you're wanting to sow seeds of discord and disinformation, you just throw multiple narratives out there. And when one of them gets brought back to you, if you're the person actually doing it, you just deny it. Say, that's not what I said. I said this. This has been going on for a very long time. The systemic attacking of Israel and Jews as white and oppressors began in the 1960s with the emergence of the Palestine Liberation Organization, who was led by Yasser Arafat, who died around 2004 at that time. He was trained, and I talk about this in my book, Zionism in the Black Church. Hey, product placement right here, boom, Zionism in the Black Church, I'll show you the video. He was trained by the KGB. This is not hearsay. This is not conspiracy theory. This is, as they say on the street, we have the receipts. He and his predecessor, and his successor, Mahmoud Abbas as well, right? And this theory part, the Marxist part, the KGB is the one who actually sowed these seeds of discord. And you use terms that everyone should agree with. Everybody believes in liberation. And if you are a person, a humanitarian, you want the Arabs to have freedom in the region like everybody else. But unfortunately, the name of the organization wasn't what it was doing. It was a free, quote unquote, Palestine from the quote unquote river to the sea. That's an annihilation of the Jewish people, the destruction of the state of Israel. That has always been the PLO's talking point, if you will, but it was as a subterfuge, almost like a deception in actually approaching it, because you couldn't really well call it, you know, the Palestine Liberation Organization that wants to destroy Israel. Nobody's going to sign up for that, right? So you make it a justice issue as much as you can. And what did Yasser Arafat do back in the 60s and the 70s, particularly after Dr. King's death in '68? He reached out to the more militant wing of the Black civil rights community and he forged ties. I don't have time to do it today, but in this picture to the far right, the black and white picture is Eldridge Cleaver, who was the Minister of Information for the Black Panthers, stood in solidarity with the Palestinians until he learned the truth. And the truth is a long story, but after a 7-year journey, he became a Zionist. We talk about that in the book as well. Eldridge Cleaver was a Zionist, a full-throated supporter of Israel and the Jewish people. This is how Dr. King addressed it during his day. On the Middle East crisis, we've had various responses. The response of some of the so-called young militants does not represent the position of the vast majority of Negroes. There are some who are color consumed, the whole whiteness thing, and they see a kind of mystique in being colored, and anything non-colored is condemned. We do not follow that course in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And certainly most of the organizations in the civil rights movement do not follow that course. Dr. King made these words, these statements 10 days before he was killed. I talk about all of this in the book. Zionism in the Black Church, why standing with Israel will be a defining issue for Christians of color in the 21st century. Zionism in the Black Church is a historic look at the 3,000-year relationship between Africa and Israel and the century-long synergy between Black and Jewish Americans, what the current challenges are, and why there's a bright path forward. It's a discussion of the Bible, music, politics, culture, and tradition. It's a story of tragedy and triumph, of pain and promise. It separates truth from fiction, reality from deception. It examines what came before in order to truly understand where we are now. It exposes decades of exploitation and reveals a remarkable persistence and strength of people whose destiny is bound together. A powerful destiny, a beautiful destiny. Zionism and the Black church, why standing with Israel will be a defining issue for Christians of color in the 21st century, by Dumisani Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, we could go on, but I'm going to stop there and give us an opportunity to talk here together. I hope this portion of it has been helpful enough. I know there's a lot of stuff that's happening all at the same time, particularly in the modern discourse in our society. But again, I also hope that some of this has been shed a little bit of a light of what we're actually dealing with right now. So Dexter, I give it over to you, sir.
All right, thanks so much for that. That was a wonderful presentation. And I am reading your book, and one of the things, and I've got like two questions. And the first one, you mentioned music about essentially how the gospel music in the African-American community or in the Black church basically helped provide a worldview and a response to the suffering that had been endured by African Americans here in the United States for a long time. And you seem to think that is a very important part of basically helping the African American community or the Black church actually get on the right side of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You seem to think that once people are able to cohere and create an identity for themselves that works, that they're going to be able to get along with the Jews in Israel. And is that right? Am I right about that?
But partially, the premise is slightly off. So one of the things I say in the book is that when it comes to the Black community in general, though there's anti-Semitism levels that are in there, I talk about that in the book, the vast majority of the Black community is not, even according to the ADL's own survey, is not. Now, there's high levels, unfortunately. So you do have a continued philo-Semitism or a favorable view of Israel or the Jews, that type of thing. Unfortunately, what you have is a more vocal minority. And that's often what you hear in terms of the rhetoric, the anti-Israel rhetoric, the anti-Jewish, that type of thing. So, but in answer to your question, though, absolutely, Dexter, because you have it within, again, broad terms, within the Black American church, or Black American culture, music plays such a powerful and key role. And one thing that has been true for centuries is that Zionism and Israel has been woven through the music of Black community from the time of slavery, even until today. I mentioned in the book how pop star, hip hop artist Lauryn Hill, who's not a Zionist, right, at all, but her seminal album was The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. The whole thing's about Jerusalem, Zion. Her son's name is Zion. She actually has a song to Zion in there. So that mentality has been there literally for centuries. It is really one of the most powerful connecting points when it comes to the Black community in terms of history.
Right. Now, another issue, one of the things is that I pay a lot of attention to people in the Christian community. And one of the things that I see, and I'm going to wade right into it, is that I see sometimes the weaponization of white guilt over Black suffering here in the United States. And what happens is that one of the things that I see people do is, in order to basically kind of get out from under that guilt, they will embrace an anti-Zionist narrative and express solidarity with people in the Black church or the African-American community that are hostile to Israel. And you see that a lot, I think, to a certain extent in public school, on the part of public school teachers, okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
What do we do?
Well, again, the question that you're asking is actually part of the fruit of a tree, meaning what has happened since the 60s is the reframing of the Israeli-Arab conflict based on race, which is why I quoted that one from Dr. King. In 1968, he was asked that question, and what we were seeing then, it was a long game that the PLO and other Israel enemies played. And that long game was, if we can convince everybody that Jews are quote unquote white, right? And therefore Jews are quote unquote part of the oppressor class, then we can effectively denigrate Israel in that way, just with a broad brush. This was a very steep climb in the late 1960s because people were more aware of what Israel was, whether it's Jews who returned from Europe, who returned from North Africa. But now in this age of misinformation, right, disinformation and pop culture, you do have Israel redefined, particularly when you're talking about the whole Durban conference, right? Zionism is apartheid, or Israel is an apartheid state. So you, Dexter, your question is people who are wanting to be on the quote unquote right side of history because there's been so much disinformation. If then that person's in that school district or whatever, or university says, I stand with Israel and for peace, they get attacked by people who think that standing with Israel is standing for imperialism and colonialism and apartheid. Of course, we know that's not true, but that's the narrative that has been created. And I'll say this last thing, unfortunately, because of the placating of certain people, sometimes even within the pro-Israel community, in order for me to win friends and influence people and make sure I have enough influence, I go ahead and concede some of these very demonic things about Israel, not really helping, right? I'm trying to show how cool and hip and with it I am, right? So I agree with you, yeah, that Israel's an apartheid state, and oh yeah, I keep nodding to those things. All I'm doing is defeating the very cause that I say I'm upholding so that I can be cool and accepted. This is part of what's going on right now.
There's a question in the Q&A. What percentage of the African-American community supports Israel? And what percentage of the clergy in the Black church are actively pro-Israel? What do you think the percentage is?
The last time I saw a poll that was anything like that, and it wasn't as clearly asked that way, it was an anti-Semitism measure, and then it was a conflict measure, if you will. And the vast majority, now I say the last time, I'm saying about 4 or 5 years ago, it was somewhere upwards of 65, 68% that sided with Israel in the conflict, and the others either with the Palestinians or were not sure. It was a clear majority, right? Now, what it is at this very moment, I couldn't tell you, but that has been pretty consistent over the last 50 plus years, somewhere between 60 to 70 something percent Black Americans. And now, again, as I'm answering that question, many people may be incredulous to that. I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, not only is that accurate in terms of those polls that were taken, not only is that accurate, I can tell you as somebody who has spent a better part of the last 7, 8 years of his life literally traveling the country, speaking to Black pastors and Christians, I can tell you there's great love for Israel, right? Of course, there's anti-Zionism, but there's anti-Zionism in the Hispanic community. There's anti-Zionism in the Asian community. There's actually that happens. What happens is that the Black community is focused on, because of the historic relationship between the Black community, the Jewish community, civil rights. So yes, it is there, but the vast majority of the Black community, as of several years ago, supports Israel in this conflict. It wants peace, but supports Israel.
Right. Now, there's another question that's similar to the one that I just asked, and it is it's kind of sad or ironic that sometimes people in their own communities will come to you and say, well, what do we do in my community? And I just asked you, what do I do with people, guilty white liberals? But here is my Reformed synagogue is mired in what they consider social justice, hosting a discussion of how congregants cope with their white guilt, but ignoring anti-Semitism of the California ethnic studies curriculum. Do you have any suggestions on how those of us who want to change this orientation can be more effective?
2 things. Find a new shul. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, hold on. Okay, so the first thing. Yeah, no, I can do it. Dexter didn't say that I said that, but I'm doing that tongue in cheek. I'm halfway serious. What I mean by that is this: have the conversation. Literally, I work throughout the Black community, Jewish community for years. I've had this discussion, and what I generally tell my Jewish brothers and sisters is have the discussion. Right? Some of them said, "I bought your book. What should I do?" Or some of them say, "I've ordered your book for this group within my synagogue." And then I'd say, "That's great. We want to have you come and speak. Whatever I can do, that's great." But I commend them, whether it's my book or whatever, for having the discussion. Right? Have the discussion. Have the dialogue. Don't shrink back from it. Right? And that way you become the person that can help, whether it's the actual rabbi, whether it's the president or some other leaders that are within the synagogue. At least you can inject some of these other, the other thoughts, the other nuances about it, right? Again, I've had conversations with you all with people who weren't aware of the anti-Semitism of the ethnic studies curriculum. They were all for it because they felt like anybody, right? Can I give a little context? I grew up in California. I was a product of the public schools up until high school. I went to a Catholic school in high school. So I know the deficiencies when it comes to the history. There was nothing about Black people until we got to slavery, right? We weren't even invented until we got to chapter 10. And the first picture of a Black person is a slave. Do you know what that does to a Black child in the classroom? There was no Crispus Attucks. There was no fighting in the Civil War. None of it, what it was boom, white people invented us and now we're slaves, right? So I'll be the first to tell you that history is deficient when it comes to how it's taught. That having been said, the critical ethnic studies curriculum is not the answer, right? flipping it around and saying white people are evil does not help me. That's not telling me about my history. It doesn't tell me Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. And it's not telling me about my history. What it's telling me is to be angry and attack people. And I tell my Jewish brothers and sisters, not only is that bad, they're coming for you, right? Once we agree that white people are evil, the next thing you're going to do is march on your shul. You have to understand what it is that you're giving voice to.
Now, there's another question. BLM is undoubtedly anti-Semitic. The issue that concerns me is that corporations have been writing checks to the movement largely to virtue signal. How do we convince large corporations to stop supporting an organization which promotes anti-Semitism?
You know what? We don't have the time for me to really unpack what I would like to say. So let me be really, really concise. Welcome to the world of the Black conscious person who's aware of stuff that'll become societally accepted, but it's death to us. This is what we're talking, whether it's education, whether it's politics, everybody signs on it because it sounds so great, but it's destroying my community. And what happens is that even Black voices get marginalized because it's not cool, hip, and with it enough. So I got a lot of passion around this because I've been doing this for a very long time, and I'm fired up and ready to go, as they would say, right? So what happens? What you're seeing is multi-billion-dollar corporations funneling money into an organization that is both anti-Semitic and has wreaked havoc on the Black community. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen? They could care less. What they care about is what they look like. And herein is the fight, right? Herein is the fight. Oftentimes we deify the Dr. Kings, right? We put their pictures, oh, how great. You know what? These people were in the fight. They actually had skin in the game, and they were by the time Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, his disapproval rating was 75%, ladies and gentlemen. He was not the lovable, he spoke out against the Vietnam War. Dr. King had his own opinions, and that's why he was a Zionist, not because somebody paid him to be, but because he knew it was the right thing, and he supported a safety where the Arabs were concerned. So what's my answer to that? We have to be willing to speak truth to power, even if a multi-billion-dollar corporation is putting its money in something that we know is wrong. I'll say this last thing. Once we become afraid, once we bow down to the pressure and say, oh, because blah, blah corporation supports it, it must be cool, we have lost. When we're willing to still be brave, what does it say at the end of the Torah cycle, my Jewish brothers and sisters? It says, be strong, and be strengthened. Say that to yourself next time you have to have a conversation. Be strong, be strengthened. Say the truth, because us not telling the truth is not going to fix anything. We have to be strong enough to have the conversation.
Now, I just want to tell you that there's an awful lot of expressions of support and gratitude for your talk and the Q&A. And people are they're jubilant, okay?
Yes, sir.
And so, let's see, here's another question. Does Reverend Washington see a connection between the rise of anti-Semitism and the increase in violent crime? The FBI recorded a 30% increase in homicide for 2022 over 2019, with the increased number of victims being largely Black.
Yes, I absolutely do, right? And again, I'm making these concise, ladies and gentlemen, because our time is limited. But when you had one of the main platforms for Black Lives Matter was defund the police, or even abolish the police, right? This is actually, some of the members will say that it's not true. It is completely true. It's still on their website, right? They have different websites, right? It's absolutely true. What that mindset has done, ladies and gentlemen, where it started was Minneapolis. Do you know that the Minneapolis City Council voted to defund the police, and right after that hired private security? Yes, welcome to the Black world, right? Absolutely. And what has happened in places like Baltimore, Chicago, Minneapolis, LA, homicides are at an all-time high. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about 5, 6-year-olds, 3-year-olds. We're talking about kids who are being killed. It's like a Vietnam War situation that's happening there. And what's the connection? What was the main, very powerful group advocating for this demonization of just all police? I told you, just when you take it from here's a racist cop or a cop who did something bad to all cops are bad, it's the same thing as coming against the Jewish people, right? Once you just paint a broad brush, you run into a lot of problems, ladies and gentlemen. And the people who have paid the most for the Israel hatred, anti-Zionism of the Black Lives Matter is the poor and working class Black community. Make absolutely no mistake about it.
Okay, now there's a question. Is all of this information in your book? It's a lot for me to digest and wrap my head around in the Zoom conference.
Yes, and virtually everything that I addressed here, both in the presentation and the Q&A, I actually addressed in my book. As a matter of fact, chapter 5 deals with anti-Zionism. We unpack the Black Hebrew Israelites, Black Lives Matter, Louis Farrakhan. We pull no punches, ladies and gentlemen. We actually talk about this whole thing. So I recommend you can download it on Kindle as well. But yes, I address virtually, including the critical ethnic studies in California, the whole how Gavin Newsom signed it into law, the fact that it's actually becoming law for K through 12. All these things are happening while we sit here. I talk about that in my book.
All right, now, what was the aha moment for you when you knew that you had to do what you're doing now? Was there a moment?
Yeah, so it was probably 2011. I'd always been pro-Israel. My family were Black Baptist church. I talk about this in my church, I mean, in my book, right? You know, the whole spiritual Zionism wasn't a political thing, but the Israel and the Jewish people. That's why I know about that whole background and everything. But it was around 2011, 2012, living in California. When I knew I was going to have to say something was when I lived in Stockton, California, but in the capital city, Sacramento, there's a measure for Sacramento to become a sister city with Ashkelon in Israel. And they had a hearing, and there was a very large Palestinian population that was there. And I was asked to come and speak in favor of the hearing, even though I lived in another city. And the whole city council thing was completely packed out. And it was like a Students for Justice in Palestine rally on a college campus somewhere. I got up, I did my 2 minutes about Israel and defending Israel and everything, and it was on. I mean, people, after it was over, a couple of people came to me and wanted to know why I did it. And I'll be honest with you, you know, a couple of people came and were Jewish Voice for Peace. Yeah, one lady came up and wanted to tell me how to be Black. I almost kind of lost it, but I kept my cool and composure and everything. And I knew at that point, because what was happening, Israel's enemies were calling Israel a Jim Crow state. It was calling Israel an apartheid state. I have South African family. My family endured Jim Crow. I got vehemently, very, very beside myself, if you will, about the fact that they're using my history to not only attack a free and democratic nation, but some of the same nations that are doing it actually have millions of Black slaves in their country. How about that for some chutzpah, right? Not only are you calling Israel racist, Libya, Qatar, Mauritania. When I saw that, Dexter, I have a big mouth like my parents of blessed memory, and I started talking. I haven't shut up yet.
Dumasani, one of the things that it's always tough is it because when between you and me, I'm a white guy, okay? Don't tell anybody, all right? But the thing is that when, you know, white pro-Israel activists start talking about Black slaves in Arab countries, they say, well, you're just doing that to make the Arabs or the Muslims look bad, and it's almost a no-go. You know, it's like, you know, and I used to make the argument, but now it's kind of like, look, I kind of have to leave that up to folks like Dumasani. What you know, is that the right strategy, do you think?
Not necessarily, Dexter, and I say this wholeheartedly, like I said before. I don't care what your color is. I don't care what your ethnic, with Jewish, non-Jewish, whatever. We should never refrain from speaking the truth. Now, yeah, granted, some people don't want to hear it, right? We get that, right? So in the Christian tradition, there's this whole don't cast your pearls before swine, right? I mean, it's the people don't want to hear it, and you know it's not going to go anywhere else. Move on to the next person. This is what I found, ladies and gentlemen. I have found, and someone said this years ago, and I really found this true. You have your really hardcore on both sides, right? There's that 10% on both sides of it, right? That are just, they're not going to hear it one way or the other. Either, for example, 10%, they're a Zionist and they don't care what's going on. If you told them that stuff was true that Israel was doing, they wouldn't even care, right? They just wave an Israeli flag, right? And then you have the other ones. I don't care if you told Israel cured every cancer in the world, fed every hungry person, they don't care, Israel must go, right? That's the fringe. There's that 80% in the middle that though somebody may be catcalling Dexter, somebody else is listening and will go and research something. They'll hear something that someone said. I'll give you a quick story. One of my friends from Zimbabwe, he saw Benjamin Netanyahu on a talk show years ago, right? And he made the statement, Israel is the first nation to take Black people out of Africa, not for slaves, but for freedom, right? Now, this is a Zimbabwean listening to this. I believe Benjamin Netanyahu is an Ashkenazi Jew. I mean, he looks white if you would just talk about color, which means nothing, but still, right? So he's listening to it and he goes, huh, It resonated. This Zimbabwean friend of mine goes to research, finds out a bunch of other stuff, becomes a Zionist after a couple of weeks, right? So he heard it from Netanyahu. And I'm not saying anything bad or good about Netanyahu, please. It's not a political statement, ladies and gentlemen. I'm saying a Zimbabwean man, a Rastafarian, right? He hears Netanyahu make this statement about Israel helping the Aliyah, the Ethiopian Jews, and that becomes his aha moment. You never know when you speak the truth, whose life you're going to impact.
Now, I guess, now there's one question, I'm just going to read it straight. If every Israeli had to leave their homes, hospitals, and their buildings when they gave to Gaza Palestinians, what did they get in return? When rockets, balloons filled with explosives and tunnels to terrorize Israel. No peace ever with this Hamas group. And does that resonate with your audiences?
Yeah. So again, I'll make this, I'll go back to what I said again. Whenever you're sharing truth, fact, ladies and gentlemen, this is what you have to remember. Because there's so much disinformation. Remember, we used to say to people, go Google it, but we know if they Google it, the first 20 things are going to be anti-Israel, or they're going to be something warped or missing context, right? The first thing is not going to come back, it's not going to be camera. That'd be great, right? But it's not, right? The first thing is not going to be Stand With Us or Ipsy and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be the Iranian Tehran Times. It's going to be the New York Times. It's going to be something that's going to be twisted in some sort of way, right? And if the New York Times is your paper, I'm sorry, just get over it, right? It's just true. You're going to find a lot of anti-Semitic stuff that's in there, right? So what you then have to do is be that willing vessel. I'll put on my preacher hat. You got to be that willing vessel to give, even if it's a nugget of information. So yes, you saying to someone, Israel withdrew every Jewish person from Gaza in 2005, and then 2 years later, Hamas is running the thing and shooting rockets. Yes, for the hardcore anti-Zionists, they couldn't care less. They'll make excuses. That's because Israel did blah, blah, blah. But for the person who can still think, who can still grasp some critical thinking, they would say, one quick, I had a relative of mine several years ago. He saw the Israel work I was doing. He goes, I'm pro-Palestinian. And I just gave him, I said, no, I hear you. I said, did you know, as we had a brief conversation, it lasted about 2 minutes. I said, at that time, Khalid Masha'al, the head of Hamas, he was still in power. I said, do you know that according to Forbes, he's worth about $2.6 billion? My cousin just looked at me. No, I didn't know that. I said, did you know that Mahmoud Abbas is worth about $500 million? So he just stares at me, right? Because I know these are things he's never heard before, right? He, as a black man, he's standing with the Palestinians because he's heard all the evil things that Israel. And when I told him that Hamas are full of Gaza's full of Hamas members that are either millionaires or billionaires, it took him back and it made him think. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to be willing to at least share something that makes someone think.
All right. I think we could go on forever and I may get yelled at, but I think we should probably kind of like bring it to an end because you've done so well and I want to go out on a high note, but, and that was a tremendous high note. And one of the things is that you mentioned that song, If the Lord Had Not Been on Our Side. I had never heard that song. Okay. Wow. So the first thing I did was I got onto YouTube and I started playing it and I started crying and I just said, Dumasani, I'm so bad at you. I don't need to start crying about this. But so I just, I think our time is up and I want to thank you so much. That was wonderful. My apologies to the questions that I didn't get to, and I want to thank you again, Reverend Dumasani, for your talk. It wasn't just thought-provoking, but it was inspiring, and I think you're going to make us ready to go out and basically stand in the breach again and some more. So if you like today's conversation, we have another one scheduled for tomorrow night, Thursday, October 28th at 7:30 Eastern Time. It's titled How Jew Hatred Manifests Itself Today and How We Can Respond. Dr. Rachel Fish will share how anti-Semitism manifests itself in real life and online, and how this particular form of hatred has entered mainstream discourse in politics, media, and social justice organizations. And again, Dumasani, I want to thank you so much for your talk, and I want to thank everyone who attended. Hallelujah and amen.
Amen.
Good afternoon. Thanks.